Part 1. A Stranger Knocked. During the storm, there are certain villages in England where silence feels older than the houses themselves. Blackthorn Hollow was one of those places. It lay hidden between low green hills and thick woodland roads, where fog gathered heavily at dusk. And church bells carried strangely across the fields. Travellers often passed the village, without noticing it at all. Those who did notice usually remembered the narrow stone bridge at the entrance, and the rows of dark hedges twisting beside the lanes like sleeping creatures. To outsiders, Blackthorn Hollow appeared peaceful. Miss Jane Marple had long ago learned not to trust peaceful places. Trouble, she often remarked quietly, prefers respectable surroundings. The trouble in Blackthorn Hollow began on a Thursday night in late November, during the worst storm the village had seen in years. The rain started shortly before sunset. By 8 o'clock, wind lashed violently against cottage roofs while thunder rolled across the hills with unsettling force. Tree branches bent low under the storm, and muddy water flooded parts of the narrow village road leading toward the bridge. Nobody remained outdoors unless absolutely necessary. Inside the Red Fox Inn, villagers gathered close to the fire, exchanging uneasy remarks about the weather, while old Mr. Dobbins polished glasses behind the counter. "It'll flood before midnight," muttered one farmer darkly. Another man glanced toward the shaking windows. Roads already half gone near Hollow Lane. Near the corner table sat Dr. Matthew Colby, the village physician, warming his hands around untouched tea. Beside him, the postmistress, Mrs. Eliza Trent, lowered her voice carefully. "Lydia Fenwick stayed alone tonight." Several heads turned immediately. Even in villages accustomed to gossip, the name Lydia Fenwick carried unusual weight. She was the wealthiest woman in Blackthorn Hollow, and perhaps the least loved. Lydia lived alone at Ravenscroft House, a large ivy-covered property standing beyond the churchyard hill. Though nearly 65, she remained sharp-minded and fiercely private. Few visitors entered Ravenscroft willingly. Fewer returned gladly. Some considered her merely cold. Others considered her cruel. There were stories, naturally, disputes over inheritance, broken friendships. A wartime scandal nobody discussed openly anymore. In villages, old secrets never disappeared completely. They simply waited. At 9:30, another violent clap of thunder shook the inn windows. Then suddenly the front door burst open. Wind and rain swept inside, alongside a tall, unfamiliar man wearing a dark, soaked overcoat. Every conversation stopped instantly. The stranger removed his hat slowly, revealing tired features and rainwater running down one side of his face. "Forgive the intrusion," he said breathlessly. "My motorcar broke down near the bridge." Mr. Dobbins frowned cautiously. "Roads dangerous tonight." "So I discovered." The man's voice carried education and restraint, though exhaustion weighed heavily beneath both. Dr. Colby rose politely. "You'll not find a mechanic before morning. I only need temporary shelter." The villagers exchanged silent glances. Strangers rarely arrived in Blackthorn Hollow, especially during storms. "Road to the inn's full tonight," Mr. Dobbins admitted reluctantly. "Flood trapped 3 travellers already." The stranger looked genuinely troubled. For a brief moment nobody spoke. Then Mrs. Trent said carefully, "Miss Fenwick sometimes rents rooms in emergencies." Several villagers stiffened immediately. Dr. Colby looked doubtful. "She dislikes unexpected visitors." "She dislikes everyone," muttered someone quietly near the fireplace. A faint weary smile crossed the stranger's face. "Under ordinary circumstances, I'd never impose." Thunder crashed again overhead. Finally, Dr. Colby sighed. "I'll take you there myself." Ravenscroft House stood alone beyond the village, beneath towering black trees twisting violently in the storm. Even in daylight, the property carried an unpleasant atmosphere. At night, it appeared almost severe, its tall, narrow windows glowing faintly through rain and darkness. Dr. Colby knocked firmly. After several moments, the door opened. Lydia Fenwick herself stood there holding a lamp high against the wind. She was a tall woman with silver hair pinned sharply away from a thin, severe face. Her dark eyes moved immediately toward the stranger beside the doctor. Displeasure appeared instantly. "Matthew?" she said coldly. "What is this?" "Emergency," Dr. Colby replied calmly. "The gentleman's stranded." Lydia examined the stranger without warmth. "What is your name?" "Edward Barron." The stranger removed his gloves politely. "I apologize for disturbing your evening." "You already have." Dr. Colby cleared his throat awkwardly. "The roads are flooded." For a moment, Miss Fenwick said nothing. Rain hammered against the stone steps while wind howled through the trees surrounding the house. Then at last she stepped aside stiffly. "One night only." Edward Barron inclined his head gratefully. "You're very kind." "No," said Lydia Fenwick quietly. "I rarely am." The storm worsened after midnight. Lightning flashed repeatedly across Blackthorn Hollow, while rainwater spilled over parts of the bridge road entirely. Most villagers slept badly. At Ravenscroft House, however, almost nobody slept at all. Shortly after 1 o'clock, the housemaid Clara Reed awoke suddenly after hearing raised voices downstairs. At first she assumed thunder caused the disturbance. Then she heard Lydia Fenwick shouting. Clara sat upright immediately. The storm muffled most words, but one sentence carried clearly through the house. "You should never have come here." A man answered sharply, though Clara could not make out the reply. Then came the sound of something breaking. Frightened, Clara remained inside her room listening. A few moments later, footsteps crossed the downstairs hallway rapidly. A door slammed. Then silence returned except for the storm itself. By morning, Edward Barron had vanished, and Lydia Fenwick was dead. Miss Marple arrived in Blackthorn Hollow 2 days later. Officially, she came to visit an old friend recovering from influenza. Unofficially, Inspector Daniel Graves requested her presence after finding himself increasingly troubled by the circumstances surrounding Lydia Fenwick's death. Miss Marple descended carefully from the afternoon train, wearing a dark wool coat and carrying a modest suitcase. The station platform smelled faintly of coal smoke and rain. Inspector Graves greeted her personally. He was a serious-looking man in his early 40s, with observant grey eyes and the exhausted expression of someone already burdened by too many unanswered questions. "Miss Marple," he said warmly, "thank you for coming." "My dear Inspector, curiosity is often stronger than common sense." A faint smile touched his face briefly. As they drove through Blackthorn Hollow beneath cold drifting fog, Miss Marple observed everything quietly. The shuttered cottages, the uneasy faces, the villagers watching the motor car pass. Fear had settled over the village quickly. "That stranger disappeared entirely?" she asked at last. Inspector Graves nodded grimly. "No luggage left behind. No damaged motor car found near the bridge either." "Interesting. And Lydia Fenwick?" "She was discovered inside her study Friday morning. How did she die?" The inspector hesitated. "Officially, heart failure." Miss Marple looked toward him calmly. "And unofficially?" She looked terrified. Silence settled briefly between them. Outside, church bells rang faintly through the mist. "There's more," Graves added quietly. "In murder cases there usually is." A burned letter was found inside the study fireplace. Miss Marple folded her gloved hands neatly in her lap. "Partially destroyed. Most of it reduced to ash. But not all." The inspector glanced toward her with reluctant admiration. "One sentence survived." "What sentence?" He slowed the motor car slightly as Ravenscroft House appeared ahead through the fog-darkened trees. Then quietly he said, "The past remembers everything." Miss Marple lifted her eyes toward the lonely house, standing beyond the hill, and somewhere deep within her thoughts, a familiar certainty stirred gently awake. Someone inside Blackthorn Hollow had spent years fearing the return of an old secret. Now death had arrived with the storm to collect it. The house beyond the hill. The morning after Miss Marple arrived in Blackthorn Hollow dawned pale and bitterly cold. Mist clung heavily to the hedges surrounding the village. and Ravenscroft House appeared almost ghost-like upon the distant hill beyond the churchyard. Even from afar, the property carried an air of isolation that seemed deeper than mere loneliness. Miss Marple noticed such things. Houses often reflected the people living inside them, and Ravenscroft had belonged to a woman who trusted almost nobody. Inspector Graves arrived shortly after breakfast to escort Miss Marple to the house itself. His expression suggested another restless night without progress. "Still, no sign of the stranger?" she asked as they drove through the narrow lane leading uphill. "Nothing." The inspector frowned toward the road ahead. No missing persons report matching his description either. That is unusual. It grows more unusual by the hour. Fog drifted low between the trees as Ravenscroft slowly emerged before them. In daylight the house appeared larger than Miss Marple expected. Built of dark grey stone, with narrow windows and climbing ivy, it possessed the severe dignity of a place designed to discourage comfort. A constable opened the front door. Inside, the air smelled faintly of extinguished firewood and lavender polish. "Miss Fenwick's maid remains upstairs," Inspector Graves explained quietly. "The poor girl's badly shaken." Miss Marple removed her gloves slowly while observing the entrance hall. Order everywhere. Not warmth. Paintings hung perfectly aligned along the walls. Furniture stood untouched by personal comfort. Even the grandfather clock near the staircase ticked with unnerving precision. A controlled house. Controlled people often hid dangerous fears. "The study is this way," said Graves. The room where Lydia Fenwick died stood at the rear of the house overlooking the rain-soaked gardens. Miss Marple entered carefully. The atmosphere struck her immediately. Not violence, disturbance. Something emotional still lingered there invisibly. Heavy curtains darkened the windows despite the weak daylight outside. Bookshelves lined 2 walls from floor to ceiling. Near the fireplace stood a large writing desk covered with neatly arranged papers, and beside the desk rested the chair where Lydia Fenwick had died. Miss Marple approached slowly. "She was found here?" she asked softly. Inspector Graves nodded. "Housemaid discovered her shortly after 8 Friday morning." "Almost." Miss Marple studied the room quietly. No obvious signs of struggle appeared. Nothing overturned. Nothing broken except for a small porcelain vase lying cracked beside the hearthrug. "What about the stranger?" she asked. "Guest room upstairs had been slept in." Graves pointed toward the fireplace. "And then we found the letter." Miss Marple crossed toward the hearth. Inside the grate lay blackened ash carefully preserved from disturbance. The inspector removed a folded evidence envelope from his coat. "We recovered only this fragment." Miss Marple examined the surviving scrap beneath the window light. The handwriting appeared elegant but hurried. "The past remembers everything." A curious sentence. Not threatening exactly, but deeply personal. "Was the letter addressed to Lydia Fenwick?" she asked. "We believe so." "Written by whom?" "That," said Inspector Graves grimly, "is the problem." They spent nearly an hour examining the study together. Miss Marple moved slowly through the room, observing details others overlooked. A photograph frame turned face down upon the bookshelf. Fresh scratches near the desk drawer lock, and most interesting of all, mud upon the carpet near the French doors leading toward the garden. The inspector noticed her attention immediately. Those doors were locked from inside. Miss Marple crouched slightly, studying the dried marks. Yet someone entered here after the storm began. "We thought perhaps the stranger, perhaps," but her voice carried uncertainty. The footprints troubled her, not because they existed, because they ended too neatly near the fireplace rug. Almost arranged. "Tell me about Lydia Fenwick," she said while rising again. Inspector Graves sighed quietly. "She inherited Ravenscroft from her older brother after the war. Considerable wealth. Considerably disliked." "Why disliked?" "She quarrelled with nearly everyone eventually." "Money." "Sometimes. Pride more often." Miss Marple glanced again toward the burned letter. "And the wartime scandal villagers avoid discussing." The inspector hesitated briefly. "You hear things quickly. My dear inspector, villages speak constantly. One merely listens selectively." A faint smile crossed his face. During the war, Lydia's younger sister disappeared under unpleasant circumstances. Disappeared? Officially, she left England suddenly. Unofficially? Nobody knows. Interesting again. Her name? Evelyn Fenwick. Miss Marple's eyes rested thoughtfully upon the rain-darkened windows. Families. Always families. Clara Reed, the housemaid, received them nervously upstairs. She could not have been older than 22 and looked exhausted from fear and lack of sleep. Her hands trembled slightly while pouring tea. "I still keep hearing the storm at night," she admitted softly. Miss Marple spoke gently. "You heard Lydia Fenwick arguing Thursday evening?" Clara nodded quickly. "After 1 o'clock. With the stranger?" "I think so. What exactly did you hear?" The girl frowned in concentration. Miss Fenwick sounded angry. Frightened too. "Frightened of what?" "I don't know." Inspector Graves folded his notebook shut briefly. "You mentioned something breaking." "Yes, sir. Like glass." "The vase downstairs, perhaps?" Clara swallowed nervously. "Then someone left the room." "Did you see who?" "No." She looked miserable suddenly. "I was too frightened to leave my room." Miss Marple watched her carefully. Fear often concealed additional things. "Miss Reed," she asked softly, "did Lydia Fenwick receive many visitors generally?" "Hardly any." "And this stranger, had she met him before?" The maid hesitated, only for a second, but Miss Marple noticed immediately. "You believe she recognised him?" Clara's face paled. "I'm not certain, but—" The girl lowered her voice instinctively. "When I brought tea earlier that evening, Miss Fenwick looked at him strangely." "How strangely?" "Like she'd seen a ghost." Silence settled briefly through the room. Inspector Graves exchanged a glance with Miss Marple. Ghosts from the past again. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited the village tea room alone. Places serving tea often contained more useful information than police files. The hollow tea rooms stood beside the post office. Warm with cinnamon and quiet conversation, villagers lowered their voices subtly when Miss Marple entered. A sure sign matters had become serious. Mrs. Eliza Trent, the postmistress, approached almost immediately carrying a fresh pot of tea. "You're helping the inspector," Miss Marple smiled politely. "I merely ask questions." "In villages, Mrs." Trent replied darkly. "Questions usually uncover unpleasant things." She sat without invitation. That too interested Miss Marple. People eager to speak often carried information pressing heavily upon them. "You knew Lydia Fenwick well?" Miss Marple asked. The woman gave a humourless laugh. "Nobody knew Lydia well, but you knew her sister." A shadow crossed Mrs. Trent's face instantly. "Evelyn." The name lingered heavily between them. "What happened to her?" Miss Marple asked quietly. The postmistress looked toward the rain-streaked windows. "She vanished during the war." "Why?" Another hesitation, then softly. "There were rumours." "About?" "A soldier." Miss Marple stirred her tea gently. "There is very often a soldier in village scandals." Mrs. Trent ignored the remark. "Evelyn was engaged to Thomas Whitmore. Local man, yes. Everyone expected marriage. And instead, she disappeared suddenly after accusations began." "What accusations?" The woman lowered her voice instinctively despite the nearly empty room. "That Evelyn betrayed someone during the war." Miss Marple became very still. "Betrayed whom?" "Nobody ever proved anything." Mrs. Trent twisted her gloves anxiously. "But a young officer died shortly afterward." "Interesting, very interesting indeed. Did Lydia believe the accusations?" "Oh, Lydia believed everything that made Evelyn look weak." Outside, wind rattled softly against the windows again. Miss Marple gazed thoughtfully into her teacup. Another sister ruined. Another old scandal buried beneath village silence. And now, decades later, someone had arrived during a storm, carrying the past back to Ravenscroft House. That evening, Inspector Graves arrived unexpectedly at the Harrow cottage, where Miss Marple stayed. His expression looked darker than before. "We identified the stranger," he said immediately. Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. "That was quick." "Not entirely." He removed a photograph from his coat pocket. A railway porter recognised the description. Miss Marple examined the image carefully. A man in his late 40s stared back at her with tired, intelligent eyes. "His name is Adrian Mercer," said Graves quietly. "Occupation? Former military intelligence." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused completely. Military intelligence. War secrets. A vanished sister. The pattern deepened suddenly. "And there's more," the inspector added. "What?" He arrived in Blackthorn Hollow, carrying documents connected to Evelyn Fenwick. Silence filled the room softly. Outside, distant thunder rolled once more beyond the hills, and Miss Marple realised the stranger had not arrived accidentally during the storm at all. He had come searching for someone, or something, and Lydia Fenwick had died terrified before he could reveal it. The sister who vanished rain drifted steadily across Blackthorn Hollow throughout the night, leaving the village wrapped in damp grey silence by morning. Miss Marple sat beside the small breakfast fire at Harrow Cottage, turning Inspector Graves's new information carefully through her mind. A stranger with ties to military intelligence, documents connected to Evelyn Fenwick, and a dead woman terrified of the past returning. The pieces were beginning to gather shape, though not yet meaning. Mrs. Eleanor Briggs, the widowed owner of Harrow Cottage, poured fresh tea while watching Miss Marple with open curiosity. "The whole village believes the stranger killed Lydia," she remarked quietly. "Villagers enjoy simple explanations." "You don't agree," Miss Marple buttered toast thoughtfully. "Murder rarely arrives neatly packaged. Human beings complicate everything." Outside, church bells sounded faintly through the mist. Mrs. Briggs lowered her voice instinctively. "People still talk about Evelyn Fenwick, even after all these years." Then she was not forgotten. The older woman gave a small, uneasy sigh. "Nobody disappears from a village completely." "Interesting. Very interesting indeed." Inspector Graves arrived shortly before 10, carrying a folder thick with wartime records. His expression suggested another sleepless night. "We traced Adrian Mercer's movements before he reached Blackthorn Hollow," he explained after settling into the drawing room. He spent the last 6 months investigating old intelligence archives. "Searching for Evelyn Fenwick, apparently." Miss Marple folded her hands gently in her lap. "And what did he discover?" The inspector hesitated. "Possibly that Evelyn never betrayed anyone." Silence settled briefly across the room. Miss Marple's eyes lifted quietly. "Ah!" Inspector Graves opened the folder. During the war, confidential information leaked from a military communications office in Kent. A young intelligence officer named Daniel Harcourt died shortly afterward during a failed operation in France. The officer connected to the village rumours. Yes. Graves nodded grimly. Evelyn Fenwick worked in the same administrative division, and suspicion fell upon her. Immediately. Miss Marple looked toward the rain-streaked window. Women were often convenient targets during wartime scandals. "There's more," said the inspector carefully. "No formal charges were ever brought against Evelyn. Because there was insufficient evidence, or because someone protected her." Miss Marple considered that quietly. Protection, or concealment. "Did Adrian Mercer know Evelyn personally?" she asked. Inspector Graves removed another document. "They worked together during the war. Interesting again. And now he arrives in Blackthorn Hollow carrying documents about her." The inspector's expression darkened, then disappears the same night Lydia Fenwick dies. A complicated pattern, but not impossible. Human beings rarely behaved logically when guilt and fear mixed together. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple visited the village churchyard alone. Fog drifted low among the gravestones, while dead leaves skittered softly across the narrow paths. Blackthorn Hollow's church stood ancient and weathered against the grey sky, its stone walls darkened by rain and age. Reverend Lionel Pierce greeted her near the chapel entrance. He was a gentle, nervous man with tired eyes and the careful manner of someone long accustomed to listening more than speaking. "You're helping Inspector Graves," he said quietly. "I'm observing people." The Reverend gave a faint, troubled smile. "In villages. That becomes dangerous. Very quickly." Miss Marple glanced toward the distant hill, where Ravenscroft House stood partially hidden among trees. "You knew the Fenwick sisters." His expression shifted immediately. Everyone knew them, but not equally. A pause followed, then softly. "Evelyn was easier to love." Miss Marple noticed the wording carefully. Past tense weighted with regret. "What sort of woman was she?" "Kind." Reverend Pierce folded his hands slowly. "Too trusting, perhaps." "And Lydia?" The Reverend sighed. "Lydia believed affection weakened people." "Interesting. How did the sisters get along?" "Poorly toward the end." "Because of the accusations?" "Yes." His voice lowered further. "Lydia publicly blamed Evelyn after the officer's death." Miss Marple became very still. "Publicly? At a village gathering?" He looked uncomfortable remembering it. "Evelyn fled Blackthorn Hollow 2 days later, and was never seen again." The church bells stirred faintly overhead. Reverend Pierce looked toward the graves thoughtfully. "I always believed Lydia regretted it afterward." "Why?" "She never spoke Evelyn's name again." Miss Marple next visited Thomas Whitmore. The man once engaged to Evelyn Fenwick now lived alone in a weathered stone cottage beyond the mill road. Though nearing 70, he remained broad-shouldered and physically strong, though sadness seemed permanently settled behind his eyes. He opened the door cautiously. When Miss Marple mentioned Evelyn's name, something inside his expression tightened painfully. "You've come about Lydia, and about Evelyn." Thomas stepped aside silently. The cottage smelled faintly of pipe smoke and old books. A fire burned low in the grate while rain tapped steadily against the windows. Miss Marple sat opposite him near the hearth. "You loved her," she said gently. The older man stared into the fire. "I intended to marry her." "What happened?" "Fear." His answer came immediately. "Villages become cruel when frightened." Miss Marple nodded faintly. "Human fear often demanded someone to blame. Did you believe Evelyn betrayed military information?" Thomas looked sharply toward her. "Never." "Then why did she leave?" Pain crossed his weathered face. "Because Lydia turned the village against her." "Interesting. Again Lydia. Always Lydia. What exactly did Lydia accuse her of?" "That Evelyn passed information to a German contact." He laughed bitterly once. "Nonsense. Evelyn barely knew how to lie properly." "Did Lydia truly believe the accusations?" A long silence followed, then quietly. "I'm not sure Lydia believed anything except her own resentment." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "Resentment toward whom?" Thomas looked toward the darkened window. Evelyn was everything Lydia wasn't. There it was. The oldest motive in existence. Jealousy. By evening, another troubling discovery emerged. Inspector Graves arrived at Harrow Cottage carrying visible frustration. "We searched Adrian Mercer's hotel room in London," he announced. "And no documents." Miss Marple looked up sharply. "They vanished. Completely." "Interesting. What kind of documents were they?" "Wartime correspondence, mostly." The inspector removed a notebook from his coat pocket, but one witness overheard Mercer mentioning a letter. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused softly. "A letter?" "Yes. Something written by Evelyn shortly before disappearing." Silence settled briefly through the room. Miss Marple stared thoughtfully into the fire. Letters mattered. They always mattered. Did Mercer claim to possess it? "We don't know." Inspector Graves rubbed tiredly at his forehead, but someone clearly wanted those documents badly enough to remove them after his disappearance. Outside, wind rattled against the cottage windows. The village seemed restless tonight somehow, fear spreading quietly again. "And the stranger himself?" Miss Marple asked. "Still no sign?" The inspector shook his head grimly. "Nothing. Not dead, perhaps. Not yet. But certainly hidden. Or hiding." That night Miss Marple found herself unable to sleep. The storm had returned lightly beyond the hills, while moonlight drifted pale through passing clouds. Blackthorn Hollow lay silent beneath darkness. She sat awake beside her bedroom window, replaying every detail carefully. A vanished sister accused falsely during wartime, a stranger arriving decades later with evidence, a burned letter inside Lydia Fenwick's study, and somewhere within all of it, fear. Not recent fear, old fear, the kind buried for years beneath silence. Then suddenly, another thought stirred quietly into place. Miss Marple rose slowly from her chair. Lydia Fenwick had not appeared shocked merely by Adrian Mercer's arrival. According to Clara Reed, she had looked as though seeing a ghost. Not surprise, recognition. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed gently, which meant Lydia already knew Adrian Mercer was connected to Evelyn, and perhaps knew exactly why he had come. At that precise moment, rapid knocking sounded downstairs. Miss Marple descended carefully to find Inspector Graves standing at the cottage doorway, soaked by rain and visibly tense. "We found something near the old bridge," he said urgently. The river below Blackthorn Bridge moved violently beneath the storm-darkened sky. Lanterns flickered along the muddy roadside where two constables stood waiting near an abandoned motorcar, half hidden among flooded brush. Miss Marple stepped carefully through wet grass beside Inspector Graves. "This belonged to Adrian Mercer," he explained quietly. The vehicle looked damaged intentionally rather than accidentally. One tyre slashed, engine wires cut cleanly. Interesting. Very interesting indeed. Then Miss Marple noticed something else. Inside the motorcar rested a leather case, partially concealed beneath the passenger seat. Inspector Graves opened it carefully. Empty, except for one small object lying inside. A silver locket. Miss Marple picked it up gently beneath the lantern light. Inside rested two faded photographs. One showed a younger Evelyn Fenwick, smiling beside a handsome military officer. The other showed Adrian Mercer standing beside Evelyn herself. Across the inside cover, engraved in delicate script, appeared 4 simple words. "Truth survives longer than lies." Rain whispered softly against the river below. And Miss Marple realised someone in Blackthorn Hollow had spent 20 years terrified that Evelyn Fenwick's truth would someday return home, the letter hidden by fire. By Thursday morning, Blackthorn Hollow had become a village ruled by whispers. The discovery of Adrian Mercer's abandoned motorcar spread quickly through the narrow lanes and cottage kitchens. Shopkeepers paused conversations when customers entered. Curtains shifted quietly whenever Inspector Graves's motorcar passed. Fear had settled deeply now. Not merely fear of murder, fear of exposure. Miss Marple recognised the difference immediately. She sat beside the fire at Harrow Cottage, studying the silver locket recovered near the bridge while rain drifted softly against the windows. "Mrs." Briggs lowered her voice, although nobody else remained in the room. "People have started speaking about Evelyn again. They never truly stopped." The older woman sighed uneasily. Some villagers still believe she betrayed that officer. And others think Lydia ruined her deliberately. Miss Marple closed the locket gently. Villagers prefer certainty, even when certainty is cruel. A knock interrupted them. Inspector Graves entered carrying a folder and visible tension. "We found traces of the burned letter," he said immediately. Miss Marple looked up. "More fragments survived?" "Barely." He removed a small evidence envelope carefully. The laboratory recovered partial words from the remaining ash. He handed her the sheet. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and read silently. She never betrayed anyone. Lydia knew. If the truth becomes public. Her eyes lifted slowly. Interesting. Very interesting indeed. Inspector Graves moved closer to the fire. Adrian Mercer brought proof connected to Evelyn's innocence. Almost certainly, and Lydia attempted to destroy it. Miss Marple remained thoughtful, or someone wished us to believe she did. The inspector frowned. "You think the burned letter could have been planted?" "My dear Inspector, murderers often arrange scenes emotionally rather than logically." He paced slowly across the room. We searched Ravenscroft again this morning, and one upstairs bedroom appears recently disturbed. Miss Marple's knitting rested forgotten beside her chair now. Whose bedroom? Evelyn Fenwick's. Silence settled briefly. The room of a vanished woman untouched for 20 years. Interesting again. Ravenscroft House felt colder than before when Miss Marple returned that afternoon. Perhaps because death no longer seemed the house's only secret. Inspector Graves led her upstairs toward the eastern wing, where few servants entered now. Dust covered the corridor thickly. At the very end stood a narrow white-painted door. Lydia kept it locked for years, the inspector explained quietly. Miss Marple entered slowly. The room carried the strange, preserved stillness of a forgotten life. Faded floral curtains hung beside the windows. Books rested neatly upon shelves untouched by time. A dressing table stood near the wall, holding silver brushes, lightly coated in dust, and above the fireplace hung a portrait of Evelyn Fenwick. Miss Marple paused before it. Evelyn possessed warmth Lydia lacked entirely. Gentle eyes, a soft, intelligent smile, the face of someone naturally trusted. "She was beautiful," Miss Marple murmured. Inspector Graves nodded faintly. "Everyone says so." Miss Marple moved carefully around the room. Unlike Lydia's study, this room felt emotional rather than controlled, a life interrupted suddenly. Then her attention shifted toward the writing desk near the window. One drawer stood slightly open. "Was this searched before?" she asked. "Yes, but not properly." She crouched slowly. Inside the drawer lining appeared uneven. Inspector Graves joined her immediately. Together they lifted the false bottom carefully. Beneath it rested several yellowed envelopes tied with pale blue ribbon. Private letters. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened quietly. The inspector opened the top envelope carefully. The handwriting matched the burned fragment recovered downstairs. Evelyn's. They read silently for several moments. Then Inspector Graves exhaled heavily. She knew. Miss Marple nodded once. Inside the letters, Evelyn repeatedly insisted she had discovered the real source of wartime leaks shortly before leaving Blackthorn Hollow. And she feared Lydia would not protect her. Interesting. Deeply interesting. "What exactly did Evelyn discover?" Graves asked quietly. Miss Marple took another letter gently. One sentence immediately caught her attention. "Lydia would rather destroy me than lose what she values most." The words settled heavily between them. "What did Lydia value most?" the inspector murmured. Miss Marple stared toward the portrait above the fireplace. "Reputation, perhaps, or inheritance, or love." Human motives rarely travelled alone. Later that evening, Miss Marple visited the Red Fox Inn. The storm had finally weakened, though cold wind still swept through the village lanes, carrying fallen leaves across the cobblestones. Inside the inn, conversation lowered noticeably when she entered. Mr. Dobbins polished glasses behind the counter with unnecessary concentration. Miss Marple selected a quiet corner table near the fire. Within minutes, Dr. Matthew Colby approached carrying tea. "You've stirred the village thoroughly," he remarked softly. "My dear doctor, the village was already stirred." He sat opposite her, looking troubled. "I keep thinking about Lydia." "In what way?" "She became nervous recently." He lowered his voice instinctively. "Far more than usual. Before Adrian Mercer arrived?" "Yes. Interesting. How nervous?" She asked strange questions. He hesitated briefly. "About old military records." Miss Marple became still. "Did she explain why?" "Claimed she was organising family papers." Dr. Colby frowned thoughtfully. "But Lydia never organised anything personally." Outside, wind rattled faintly against the inn windows. Miss Marple stirred her tea carefully. "Did she fear someone specifically?" The doctor hesitated again, then quietly. "She asked whether a person could be arrested decades after wartime crimes." Silence settled softly around them. Interesting indeed. "Did you answer?" "I told her serious cases remain serious regardless of time." Dr. Colby looked uneasy suddenly. "You think Lydia was involved somehow?" Miss Marple's gaze rested calmly upon the fire. I think fear usually grows from knowledge. As Miss Marple prepared to leave the inn later that evening, she noticed Thomas Whitmore standing alone near the doorway. He appeared tense, more tense than before. "Mr. Whitmore," she said gently. He looked toward her sharply. "Miss Marple, you seem troubled." The older man glanced around carefully before speaking. "I received a letter tonight. Interesting." "From whom?" "I don't know." He removed the folded paper reluctantly from his coat pocket. The message contained only one sentence. "Evelyn did not leave willingly." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. No signature again, no explanation, but the wording mattered deeply. Not leave willingly, which suggested something entirely different from simple disappearance. "Who delivered this?" she asked. Thomas shook his head. "Found it beneath my door." Fear had entered his face now openly, not merely grief anymore. Fear of what he might finally learn. "Did Evelyn ever contact you after leaving Blackthorn Hollow?" Miss Marple asked softly. Pain crossed his expression. "Only once." "When?" "About 3 months later." "And what did she say?" Thomas stared toward the dark, rain-swept windows. "She wrote that she'd made a terrible mistake trusting someone." Miss Marple felt a cold, quiet certainty beginning to form. Someone had betrayed Evelyn. Not during the war, perhaps, but afterward, someone close enough to destroy her completely. That night, Inspector Graves arrived unexpectedly once more. His face looked grim beneath the hallway lamp. "We found Adrian Mercer," he said quietly. Miss Marple stood immediately. "Alive?" "Yes." "Where?" "Hiding in an abandoned shepherd's cottage beyond Hollow Ridge." "Interesting. Why hiding?" The inspector removed his gloves slowly. "Because someone tried to kill him the night Lydia died." Silence settled heavily between them. Outside, thunder rolled faintly once more beyond the hills. Miss Marple looked toward the darkness thoughtfully. The stranger had not vanished after committing murder. He had vanished because he feared becoming the next victim. And somewhere inside Blackthorn Hollow, someone still desperately needed Evelyn Fenwick's truth, buried forever. The man who returned from the past. The shepherd's cottage stood alone upon Hollow Ridge overlooking miles of rain-darkened countryside. Wind swept fiercely across the hilltops as Inspector Graves drove Miss Marple along the narrow, muddy track shortly after dawn. Below them, Blackthorn Hollow appeared distant and grey, beneath drifting mist. Its cottages clustered together like uneasy secrets. "You're certain Mercer's telling the truth?" Miss Marple asked quietly. Inspector Graves kept his eyes fixed upon the road. "I'm certain he's frightened." Fear again. Always fear. The cottage itself looked barely habitable. Smoke drifted weakly from the chimney while broken fencing leaned crookedly nearby. A constable opened the door as they approached. Inside, Adrian Mercer sat near the fire wrapped in borrowed blankets. He looked older now than in the photograph Miss Marple had seen earlier. Exhaustion hollowed his features deeply, though intelligence remained sharp behind tired eyes. The moment Miss Marple entered, he studied her carefully. "So," he said softly, "they finally sent Miss Marple." A curious remark. "You know of me?" Mercer gave a faint, humourless smile. "Anyone connected to difficult truths eventually hears your name." Inspector Graves remained standing near the doorway. "You told us someone attacked you Thursday night." Mercer nodded slowly. "Near the bridge." "Who?" "I never saw clearly." Miss Marple observed him quietly. A practised answer, perhaps. Or a cautious one. "You came to Blackthorn Hollow because of Evelyn Fenwick," she said gently. His expression changed immediately. Pain entered it. Real pain. "Yes, you cared for her." The fire crackled softly between them. "She saved my life once. Interesting." "How?" Mercer leaned back tiredly. "During the war, I worked counterintelligence operations in London. Evelyn handled communications archives." He paused briefly. "She discovered someone inside our office was leaking information." Inspector Graves folded his arms, and she identified the source. "Yes. Who was it?" Adrian Mercer looked toward the window where rain streaked against cracked glass. "That's where everything became dangerous." Miss Marple waited patiently. People often revealed truths more completely when silence unsettled them. At first, Mercer continued quietly, Evelyn believed she could expose the leak properly through official channels. Then documents began disappearing, and suspicion turned toward her instead. A bitter shadow crossed his face. Conveniently. Inspector Graves stepped forward sharply. You're suggesting someone framed Evelyn Fenwick deliberately. I'm stating it. Silence settled heavily through the cottage. Miss Marple's thoughts moved carefully. Another woman destroyed. Another accusation arranged conveniently. Human nature remained painfully consistent across generations. What role did Lydia Fenwick play? She asked softly. Mercer's expression hardened at once. She knew the accusations were false. Interesting. How? Because Evelyn told her everything. Inspector Graves frowned deeply. And Lydia remained silent? Mercer looked toward the fire again. Not silent. Worse. The room grew very still. What do you mean? Asked Miss Marple. Mercer's voice lowered. Lydia used the scandal to remove Evelyn permanently from Blackthorn Hollow. Rain continued throughout the afternoon. Back in the village, Miss Marple sat beside the fire at Harrow Cottage, replaying Adrian Mercer's words carefully. Not silent. Worse. Inspector Graves paced slowly across the room. You think Lydia intentionally allowed her sister to be destroyed? Miss Marple threaded another stitch thoughtfully. I think Lydia benefited from Evelyn's ruin. And what exactly did she gain? Possibly everything. The inspector stopped pacing. Inheritance? Perhaps. Miss Marple glanced toward the window. But emotional motives often outweigh financial ones inside families. Graves looked unconvinced. You suspect jealousy again? My dear Inspector, jealousy explains half the tragedies in England. A knock interrupted them. Mrs. Briggs entered, looking unsettled. There's someone asking for you. Thomas Whitmore stood in the hallway, drenched from rain and visibly shaken. Miss Marple noticed immediately that something serious had changed. They found another letter, he said quietly. Inspector Graves straightened instantly. Where? At Ravenscroft. The letter had been hidden inside Evelyn Fenwick's old bedroom, beneath a loose floorboard near the fireplace. Unlike the burned fragment downstairs, this one remained intact. Inspector Graves unfolded it carefully upon Lydia Fenwick's study desk, while rain tapped steadily against the windows beyond. Miss Marple read silently beside him. The handwriting belonged unmistakably to Evelyn. Lydia, if anything happens to me, Adrian knows the truth. I trusted you because you are my sister. But now I believe you fear scandal more than justice. Someone inside the office is protected by powerful people, and I think you already know this. If I disappear, it will not be voluntary, Evelyn. The room fell silent. Even Inspector Graves seemed briefly stunned. Good God, he murmured. Miss Marple looked toward the cold fireplace thoughtfully. Evelyn had feared betrayal before vanishing, and she had specifically feared Lydia. Interesting. Very interesting indeed. Thomas Whitmore stood pale beside the doorway. She tried telling someone, he whispered, and nobody helped her. Miss Marple studied him carefully. Grief still lived inside him after 20 years. That sort of grief often transformed into dangerous things eventually. Mr. Whitmore, she said gently. Did Evelyn ever mention another person connected to the wartime leaks? A strange hesitation crossed his face. Then quietly. Only once. Inspector Graves looked sharply toward him. Who? Thomas swallowed hard. A man named Richard Vale. Silence followed instantly. Inspector Graves frowned. The industrialist? You know him? Everyone knows him. Graves looked troubled suddenly. Vale funded half the wartime supply contracts in Kent. Interesting again. And Evelyn suspected him? Miss Marple asked. Thomas nodded slowly. She believed military information was being sold through one of his associates. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. A wealthy, influential man. Enough power to bury scandals. Enough influence to redirect blame. Very dangerous indeed. That evening, the atmosphere in Blackthorn Hollow shifted once more. fear mixed now with something heavier, realization. The village was beginning to understand that Lydia Fenwick's death connected not merely to old gossip, but potentially to wartime corruption buried for decades. At the Red Fox Inn, conversations stopped entirely when Inspector Graves entered. Miss Marple remained quietly near the fire, while villagers exchanged nervous glances. Then Mrs. Eliza Trent approached carefully. "You've learned something about Evelyn." Miss Marple looked up gently. People seem very interested in Evelyn suddenly. The postmistress lowered her voice, because some of us never believed she betrayed anyone. Interesting, yet nobody defended her publicly. Pain crossed Mrs. Trent's face. People were frightened during the war. "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "Fear makes cowards of communities." The older woman looked toward the dark windows uneasily. "There were rumours afterward." "What sort of rumours?" "That Evelyn tried returning once." Miss Marple became very still. "Returning to Blackthorn Hollow." A nervous nod. "About a year after disappearing. Interesting indeed." "What happened?" "No one knows for certain." Mrs. Trent twisted her gloves anxiously. "But Lydia travelled to London suddenly that same week." Miss Marple felt another piece shift quietly into place. A vanished woman, a frightened sister, and now evidence suggesting Evelyn may not have vanished willingly at all. The pattern was darkening. Near midnight, Inspector Graves arrived once more at Harrow Cottage, carrying visible urgency. "We searched Lydia's financial records." Miss Marple set aside her knitting immediately. "And?" "She made regular payments over the last 15 years. "Interesting. Blackmail." "That's our assumption." "To whom?" The inspector removed a small notebook from his coat pocket. The payments were collected through different banks under false names. He paused, "But they all connect eventually to one account." Miss Marple looked toward him calmly. "Whose account?" Inspector Graves hesitated, then quietly. "Richard Vale." Silence settled heavily through the room. Outside, wind moved softly through the trees surrounding the cottage. Miss Marple stared thoughtfully into the fire. So Lydia Fenwick had been paying someone connected to wartime secrets for years. Not guilt alone then, fear, sustained fear. And somewhere beneath all of it waited the final question troubling her most deeply. If Richard Vale benefited from Evelyn's destruction, why had Adrian Mercer returned now after 20 years? At that precise moment, another knock sounded sharply at the door. A constable entered breathless from the rain. "Sir," he said urgently, "there's been another attack." Inspector Graves stood instantly. "Who?" The constable swallowed hard. "Thomas Whitmore." And suddenly the room felt colder than the storm outside. Blood on Hollow Ridge Thomas Whitmore was found shortly after midnight, beside the old quarry road leading toward Hollow Ridge. Rain had washed much of the blood into the mud before villagers discovered him. One arm lay twisted awkwardly beneath his body, and a deep wound marked the side of his head where something heavy had struck him. Yet he remained alive. Barely. Miss Marple arrived alongside Inspector Graves and Dr. Colby as constables carried Thomas carefully into the village surgery. The atmosphere inside the small building felt strained and urgent. Lamps burned brightly against the darkness, while wind rattled softly against the windows. Dr. Colby worked silently for several minutes before finally removing blood-stained gloves with visible relief. "He'll survive," the doctor said quietly. "Though he's fortunate." Inspector Graves exhaled slowly. "Was he conscious long enough to say one thing?" Miss Marple looked up immediately. "What, Doctor?" Colby hesitated. He said, "She lied about everything." Silence settled heavily across the room. Interesting, very interesting indeed. By morning, Blackthorn Hollow no longer resembled merely a frightened village. It resembled a village under siege. Another attack meant the danger had not ended with Lydia Fenwick's death. Someone still believed old truths needed burying. Miss Marple sat beside the surgery window, while Inspector Graves paced restlessly nearby. "Whitmore was returning home from the inn," the inspector said. "Somebody waited for him near the quarry. Planned rather than impulsive. Exactly. Miss Marple folded her hands thoughtfully. Did he carry anything? A letter. Interesting. Inspector Graves removed a folded envelope from his pocket. We found this beside him. Miss Marple opened it carefully. Inside rested a single page torn from an old wartime file. Most of the text remained damaged by rainwater, but one sentence survived clearly. Internal leak traced to civilian contractor contact. Civilian contractor. Richard Vale. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed gently. Someone had attempted to silence Thomas Whitmore before he could connect the wartime leaks publicly. But why now? Why after 20 years? The answer waited somewhere very close. That afternoon, Miss Marple requested to see Lydia Fenwick's personal accounts herself. Inspector Graves arranged access reluctantly. Ravenscroft House stood silent beneath grey skies as they entered the study once more. The room felt different now, less threatening perhaps, as though death had finally loosened the tension trapped inside its walls for years. Ledgers covered Lydia's desk neatly. Miss Marple examined them carefully, while Inspector Graves stood nearby, smoking impatiently near the fireplace. She recorded everything, he muttered. Controlled people usually do. Hours passed quietly. Most entries appeared ordinary: household expenses, property taxes, servant wages. Then Miss Marple noticed something unusual. Every 6 months, Lydia withdrew identical sums of money in cash. Not random amounts, calculated ones. Inspector Graves leaned closer. The blackmail payments. Perhaps. Miss Marple traced one entry thoughtfully. What interests me is the timing. How so? The withdrawals began shortly after Evelyn vanished. She looked up slowly. Not 15 years ago. The inspector frowned deeply. You think Lydia paid someone all this time? Yes. For what exactly? Miss Marple gazed toward the rain-darkened windows. Silence, silence again. Not guilt merely, protection. Someone had known the truth about Evelyn from the beginning. And Lydia Fenwick had spent 20 years terrified they would reveal it. Later that evening, Adrian Mercer finally agreed to speak fully. Inspector Graves arranged the meeting privately inside the library at Ravenscroft House. Outside, rain drifted softly across the gardens while firelight flickered against the tall shelves lining the walls. Mercer looked exhausted. Not merely physically, emotionally exhausted, like a man carrying grief too long. Miss Marple sat opposite him quietly. You loved Evelyn Fenwick, she said gently. A faint shadow crossed his face. I intended to marry her eventually. Interesting. Did she love you? The answer came softly but without hesitation. Inspector Graves folded his arms. Then why didn't she leave with you when the accusations began? Mercer stared into the fire. Because she believed she could still stop them. Stop whom? A long silence followed. Then, Richard Vale. The room became still. Mercer leaned forward slowly. Evelyn discovered Vale's company passed military transport schedules through intermediaries during the war. For profit, for survival. His expression hardened bitterly. Some people became very wealthy during wartime. Miss Marple watched him carefully. And Lydia knew this. Yes. How? Richard Vale courted her once. Interesting indeed. Very interesting. Inspector Graves looked sharply toward him. Lydia and Vale were involved? Briefly. Mercer gave a humourless laugh, until Evelyn discovered what kind of man he really was. Another piece settling quietly into place. What happened afterward? Miss Marple asked softly. Mercer looked toward the dark windows. Evelyn threatened to expose him, and then she vanished. Yes. Silence spread heavily through the library. At last Inspector Graves spoke quietly. You believe Richard Vale arranged Evelyn's disappearance? Mercer's eyes lifted coldly. I know he did. The revelation shook Blackthorn Hollow deeply. By nightfall rumours moved through the village faster than the rainwater running along the lanes. A wartime conspiracy. A wealthy businessman. A vanished woman. And now murder. Miss Marple walked alone briefly through the village, before returning to Harrow Cottage. She noticed something important immediately. People no longer feared Adrian Mercer. They feared the truth itself. Fear changed direction quickly in villages. At the church gate, she encountered Reverend Pierce locking the chapel doors. The clergyman looked pale and troubled. "Things are becoming ugly," he murmured. They were always ugly. People simply hid it better. He sighed heavily. "Do you think Richard Vale killed Lydia?" Miss Marple considered carefully. "Possibly, but something troubles me." "What?" "Lydia Fenwick lived 20 years under fear and blackmail, yet she only died after Adrian Mercer arrived." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "That suggests someone believed Mercer carried evidence dangerous enough to destroy them immediately." The Reverend looked uneasy suddenly. "You think the killer is still here in Blackthorn Hollow?" "My dear Reverend," said Miss Marple softly, "killers are almost always closer than villages wish to believe." Near midnight, Inspector Graves arrived again. His expression told Miss Marple immediately that something serious had happened. "We searched Richard Vale's London office. And he's gone. Interesting. Disappeared. Left suddenly yesterday morning." Miss Marple looked toward the fire quietly. "Running. People only ran when fear finally outweighed confidence." "There's more," Graves added grimly. "What now?" "We found a photograph hidden inside Lydia Fenwick's desk." He handed it to her carefully. Miss Marple examined it beneath the lamplight. The image showed 4 people standing together outside Ravenscroft House many years earlier. Young Lydia Fenwick, Evelyn, Adrian Mercer, and Richard Vale, but it was not the people themselves that caught Miss Marple's attention. It was Lydia's expression, while everyone else smiled naturally toward the camera. Lydia stared directly at Richard Vale with unmistakable fear already visible in her eyes. Miss Marple became very still, because suddenly she understood something profoundly important. Lydia Fenwick had not protected Richard Vale for 20 years out of love. She had protected him because she herself had once helped him destroy Evelyn. What Lydia Fenwick buried. The photograph remained upon Miss Marple's lap long after Inspector Graves stopped speaking. Outside, rain whispered softly against the windows of Harrow Cottage, while the village slept uneasily beneath drifting fog. Lydia's expression haunted her. Not affection, not admiration, fear, old fear. The kind rooted deeply enough to survive decades. Inspector Graves stood near the fireplace watching her carefully. "You think Lydia was involved directly in Evelyn's disappearance?" Miss Marple lifted her eyes slowly. "I think Lydia made a terrible choice many years ago and spent the rest of her life imprisoned by it." The inspector frowned. "That sounds dangerously sympathetic." "My dear Inspector, understanding people is not the same as forgiving them." He paced thoughtfully across the room. "If Lydia helped Richard Vale silence Evelyn, why allow Adrian Mercer into the house at all? Interesting question." "Perhaps," said Miss Marple quietly, "she believed the past could still be controlled." Outside, thunder rolled faintly beyond the hills, but Miss Marple already suspected the past had stopped obeying anyone long ago. The following morning brought sharp cold sunlight for the first time in days. Blackthorn Hollow appeared deceptively peaceful beneath pale blue skies and drifting frost. Villagers moved cautiously through the lanes, though conversations still died whenever Inspector Graves appeared. Fear remained everywhere. At Ravenscroft House, Miss Marple requested access to Lydia Fenwick's private bedroom. The inspector seemed surprised. "You think she hid something there?" Controlled people seldom keep their deepest secrets in obvious places. The bedroom reflected Lydia perfectly. Dark polished furniture, precise order, not a single unnecessary object anywhere. Yet Miss Marple noticed immediately that one wall differed slightly from the others. Near the wardrobe stood a narrow bookshelf, built directly into the panelling. The wood around its edges appeared more worn. She crossed the room slowly. "Inspector," she said quietly. Together they examined the shelf carefully. A hidden latch revealed itself after several moments. The panel opened inward silently. Behind it rested a small concealed compartment, and inside, bundles of letters tied with black ribbon. Inspector Graves exhaled sharply. Good God! Miss Marple lifted the top letter carefully. Every envelope bore Richard Vale's name. Interesting indeed. Very interesting. They moved toward the fire and began reading. The earliest letters dated back nearly 20 years. At first, the correspondence appeared formal. Then darker patterns emerged quickly. You understand what would happen if Evelyn returned. Certain sacrifices were necessary. Your silence protects both of us. Miss Marple's expression grew quieter with every page. Lydia had not merely feared Richard Vale, she had become trapped by him. Inspector Graves unfolded another letter abruptly, then stopped cold. What is it? Asked Miss Marple softly. The inspector handed her the page. Lydia, you were the one who convinced Evelyn to meet us that night. Never forget that. R.V. Silence filled the room completely. Miss Marple stared at the words thoughtfully. Not murder, perhaps, but betrayal. And betrayal destroyed lives just as effectively. That afternoon, Adrian Mercer agreed to identify the location where Evelyn Fenwick disappeared. The road leading there wound beyond Hollow Ridge, toward abandoned military storage buildings left from wartime operations. Most now stood empty and decaying. Cold wind swept through broken fencing while crows circled overhead. Mercer walked beside Miss Marple quietly, his face pale with old memory. She came here believing Lydia wished to help her, he said at last. Inspector Graves looked sharply toward him. You're certain? Evelyn wrote me before leaving London, she said. Lydia arranged a private meeting with someone who could expose the real leak. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed gently. But instead she met Richard Vale. Mercer nodded once. Pain crossed his face visibly now. I arrived too late. The abandoned storage building ahead looked bleak beneath the grey sky. Broken windows, rusting doors, silence everywhere. A place built to hide unpleasant things. Inspector Graves motioned toward the interior. We searched here previously after Evelyn disappeared. Mercer gave a bitter laugh. Officially, Richard Vale had influential friends. Inside, dust covered the concrete floor thickly. Miss Marple moved slowly through the shadows, while wind moaned faintly through broken glass overhead. Then suddenly she stopped. Near the far wall, partially hidden beneath collapsed crates, lay something metallic. Inspector Graves bent carefully. A woman's compact mirror. Old, tarnished with age. Inside, faint initials remained visible. E.F. silence settled heavily around them. Miss Marple closed the compact gently. Evelyn had been here, and perhaps never left willingly at all. By evening another revelation emerged unexpectedly. Thomas Whitmore regained enough strength to speak clearly. Miss Marple and Inspector Graves visited him shortly after sunset. The older man looked weak but determined now, as though years of silence had finally become unbearable. There's something I never told anyone, he said quietly. Miss Marple sat beside the bed patiently. About Evelyn? A slow nod. She contacted me one last time after disappearing. Inspector Graves leaned forward immediately. When? About 6 months later. From where? France. Interesting. Did she explain what happened? Miss Marple asked softly. Thomas closed his eyes briefly. She said Lydia betrayed her. Silence followed. Not surprising now, but still tragic. She claimed Richard Vale forced her to leave England after threatening Adrian Mercer. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Threatening him how? Thomas looked toward the darkened window. Mercer had gathered evidence against Vale during the war. Evelyn believed Vale would kill him if she stayed. Another sacrifice. Another life ruined by fear. And why didn't Evelyn return later? Inspector Graves asked quietly. Pain crossed Thomas's face deeply. She intended to. He swallowed hard. Then her letters stopped suddenly. The room became still. Miss Marple understood immediately. Evelyn likely died years ago, far from Blackthorn Hollow, far from home, and Lydia Fenwick had carried knowledge of that fate alone ever since. That night Miss Marple sat awake beside her bedroom fire, unable to rest. The case had grown darker than murder now. It had become a story of cowardice stretching across decades. Lydia betrayed Evelyn. Richard Vale profited from wartime corruption. Adrian Mercer spent years searching for truth, and someone still attempted to silence people now. But one question remained unresolved. Who killed Lydia Fenwick? Miss Marple stared thoughtfully into the flames. Richard Vale possessed motive, certainly. Yet something about the crime itself troubled her. The theatrical storm, the stranger arriving publicly, the burned letter, almost as though someone wished attention directed toward the past dramatically. Then another thought surfaced quietly. Lydia had expected danger before Adrian Mercer arrived. Dr. Colby confirmed it, which meant someone besides Mercer frightened her already. At that precise moment, rapid knocking sounded downstairs. Moments later, Inspector Graves entered pale-faced and visibly tense. They found Richard Vale. Miss Marple stood immediately. Where? In London. The inspector removed his gloves slowly. Dead. Silence crashed softly through the room. How? Shot inside his private office. Outside, wind moved through the dark village trees once more, and Miss Marple realised the killer had just removed the one man capable of confirming exactly what happened to Evelyn Fenwick 20 years earlier. The night Evelyn disappeared, Richard Vale's murder changed the investigation completely. Until then, Blackthorn Hollow had been looking backward toward an old wartime betrayal. Now the danger had become immediate once again. Someone alive, someone frightened, had begun destroying the final remaining witnesses. Miss Marple understood what that meant before Inspector Graves said it aloud. "The killer's losing control," she remarked quietly, the following morning. Snow threatened beyond the hills, while cold wind swept through the village lanes. Inside Harrow Cottage, Inspector Graves stood near the fire, studying reports from London with visible frustration. Vale's office was cleaned thoroughly before police arrived, he muttered. Files missing. Safe emptied. Not by professionals, Miss Marple replied calmly. The inspector looked toward her. You're certain? Professionals remove everything. She threaded another stitch neatly. Frightened people overlook details. Interesting details, usually. A knock interrupted them. Constable Briggs entered, carrying a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. This arrived for Miss Marple. No sender. No note attached externally. Inspector Graves stiffened immediately. Careful. Miss Marple opened the parcel slowly. Inside rested a leather-bound notebook badly damaged by age and moisture. Adrian Mercer's expression changed the instant he saw it later that afternoon at Ravenscroft House. Evelyn's journal, he whispered. Silence settled through the study. Miss Marple opened the notebook carefully. Several pages had become unreadable over time, but enough survived, and with every line, the final days before Evelyn Fenwick's disappearance began emerging from shadow. The journal entries were brief but deeply troubled. Evelyn described growing fear inside the Wartime Intelligence Office, where she worked. Documents disappearing. People watching her. Conversations stopping abruptly when she entered rooms. Then came Richard Vale's name repeatedly. Miss Marple read quietly aloud. Richard visited Lydia again tonight. She says I imagine danger where none exists, but she looked frightened when I mentioned the transport records. Inspector Graves leaned closer. Lydia already knew. Yes, Miss Marple murmured softly, long before the accusations began. Another entry followed 3 days later. Adrian believes someone inside the office protects Vale. I no longer know whom to trust. Then, finally, one final readable page written shakily. Lydia asked me to meet her at St. Anne's Chapel tomorrow night. She claims Richard wishes to confess everything privately before authorities become involved. I want desperately to believe her. Miss Marple closed the journal gently. Poor child, trusting until the very end. Adrian Mercer stood near the fireplace, staring into nothing. She thought Lydia chose her side at last. But instead, said Inspector Graves grimly, she walked into a trap. Silence followed heavily. Miss Marple's thoughts moved carefully through the emerging picture. Lydia arranged the meeting. Richard Vale attended. Evelyn died. Yet something still troubled her deeply, not what happened afterward. What happened during? That evening, Miss Marple requested another conversation with Reverend Pierce. The clergyman received her nervously inside the small chapel office beside the churchyard. Candles flickered softly against ancient stone walls while snow began drifting outside the windows. "You were in Blackthorn Hollow when Evelyn vanished," Miss Marple said gently. "Yes, and you conducted a prayer service afterward." The Reverend looked uncomfortable immediately. "How did you know?" "Villagers remember ceremonies." He folded his hands slowly. "People believed Evelyn had fled in disgrace. But you did not." A pause followed, then quietly. "I thought something felt wrong, interesting." "How so?" Reverend Pierce looked toward the candlelight. Lydia attended the service. His voice lowered further. She seemed terrified rather than angry. Miss Marple became still. Fear again, not grief, not outrage. Fear. What exactly did Lydia say? The Reverend hesitated. Only one sentence afterward. "And that was?" She asked whether God forgives people who stay silent. Silence settled softly through the small chapel room. Miss Marple looked thoughtfully toward the falling snow beyond the windows. Staying silent. Interesting wording. Not killing. Not betraying. Silent. Later that night, Inspector Graves arrived at Harrow Cottage carrying another disturbing discovery. "We identified the gun used to kill Richard Vale." Miss Marple looked up immediately. "And it belonged to someone in Blackthorn Hollow. Interesting indeed. Who?" The inspector removed his gloves slowly. "Dr. Matthew Colby." Silence settled between them. Miss Marple did not appear surprised. The inspector noticed immediately. "You suspected him." "I noticed him." "That's not the same thing." "My dear inspector, it very often is." He paced slowly near the fire. "Colby claims the revolver was stolen weeks ago." "And do you believe him?" "I don't know what to believe anymore." Miss Marple folded her knitting quietly. "Doctor, Colby had remained strangely close to every stage of the investigation. Close to Lydia, close to the wartime history, close to the victims. Very close indeed." "What was his relationship with the Fenwick sisters?" she asked softly. Inspector Graves frowned. "According to village records, Colby arrived in Blackthorn Hollow shortly before Evelyn disappeared." "Interesting, very interesting." "How old was he then?" "Mid-20s. Young enough. Young doctors often became deeply entangled in village emotions before realizing danger existed." Miss Marple gazed thoughtfully into the flames. Another memory surfaced quietly. Dr. Colby's reaction whenever Evelyn's name arose. Not curiosity, not professional detachment. Something far more personal. Near midnight, Adrian Mercer requested to speak privately with Miss Marple. They sat together inside Ravenscroft House, while wind moved softly through the trees outside. Mercer looked exhausted beyond measure now. "Evelyn trusted the wrong people," he said quietly. Miss Marple studied him gently. "Perhaps she trusted too completely." A faint sad smile crossed his face. "That sounds like her." For several moments neither spoke. Then Miss Marple asked softly, "Did Evelyn ever mention Dr. Colby?" Mercer became very still. "Interesting." "Yes." "In what way?" "He admired her." "More than admired." Mercer stared toward the dark fireplace. "I think he loved her." There it was, at last. Miss Marple felt another piece settle quietly into place. And Evelyn? She cared for him as a friend. Mercer hesitated briefly, but her heart belonged elsewhere, to Adrian Mercer himself. Unreturned love, one of the oldest and most dangerous motives in existence. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "Did Colby know about Richard Vale?" "Yes. And Lydia?" Mercer nodded slowly. Everyone close to Evelyn eventually learned pieces of it. Outside, snow thickened steadily across Blackthorn Hollow. Miss Marple sat very quietly, because suddenly she understood something profoundly important. The person who killed Richard Vale likely did not act to protect wartime secrets anymore. They acted because those secrets had already destroyed the woman they loved once. And grief buried for 20 years, could become something far more dangerous than hatred. The secret beneath the chapel floor Blackthorn Hollow awoke beneath a hard white frost the morning after Richard Vale's death. The news spread quickly despite Inspector Graves' efforts to contain it. By breakfast, villagers gathered outside the bakery and post office speaking in frightened whispers. Some claimed Vale's murder proved Evelyn Fenwick's innocence at last. Others feared someone connected to the old wartime scandal had begun eliminating everyone involved. Miss Marple believed both theories dangerously incomplete. She sat quietly beside the drawing-room fire at Harrow Cottage, while Inspector Graves stood near the window, reviewing telegrams from London. "Vale was killed sometime after midnight," he said grimly. "Single gunshot. Close range. Professional? Possibly." Miss Marple folded her hands gently. "Or personal?" The inspector looked toward her. "You think Lydia's killer murdered Vale too?" "I think panic has entered this matter." Her voice remained soft, and frightened people often become reckless. Outside, church bells echoed faintly through the cold morning air. Inspector Graves exhaled tiredly. "There's something else." Miss Marple looked up. "Before dying, Vale telephoned his solicitor. Interesting. What did he say?" "Only one sentence." Graves hesitated briefly. "He told the solicitor to release Evelyn Fenwick's file if anything happened to him." Silence settled heavily through the room. At last. The truth was finally beginning to surface openly. The file arrived from London shortly before noon. Inspector Graves insisted upon examining it privately with Miss Marple inside Lydia Fenwick's study at Ravenscroft House. The atmosphere inside the room felt strange now, less oppressive, as though years of secrecy had begun slowly loosening their grip upon the walls themselves. The file contained wartime records, intelligence reports, and several personal letters written by Evelyn. But one document immediately captured Miss Marple's attention, a sworn statement signed by Adrian Mercer. Inspector Graves read aloud quietly. "Evidence suggests military route information passed through Richard Vale's shipping contacts during 1943 operations. Evelyn Fenwick discovered irregular communications and intended formal disclosure." He stopped reading, then slowly turned the page. Attached beneath the statement rested another document, unsigned, handwritten. Miss Marple leaned closer. The handwriting belonged unmistakably to Lydia Fenwick. "I thought protecting Richard would protect myself. I did not understand how far things would go until Evelyn disappeared." Silence spread softly through the study. Inspector Graves lowered the paper carefully. She admitted involvement. "Partially," Miss Marple corrected gently. The inspector frowned. "You think she concealed more?" "My dear Inspector, guilt rarely tells the whole truth voluntarily." Miss Marple studied the remaining pages carefully. Then suddenly her eyes narrowed. "Interesting. Very interesting indeed." "What is it?" Graves asked. She tapped one particular sentence quietly. "Evelyn arranged to meet us at St. Anne's Chapel before leaving England." St. Anne's Chapel. Miss Marple looked up slowly. "That chapel stands abandoned outside the village, doesn't it?" The inspector became still. "Yes." "Then I believe," said Miss Marple softly, "we should visit it immediately." St. Anne's Chapel stood nearly a mile beyond Blackthorn Hollow, hidden among bare winter trees. Once beautiful, the old stone building had long since fallen into neglect. Ivy climbed across broken walls, while frost silvered the surrounding graveyard beneath the pale afternoon sky. Miss Marple felt unease the moment they arrived. Not supernatural unease, human unease. The atmosphere of a place where suffering had once settled deeply. Inspector Graves forced open the warped chapel door carefully. Dust swirled through weak sunlight filtering across the cracked pews. "It hasn't been used in years," he murmured. Miss Marple moved slowly down the aisle. "Evelyn arranged to meet us here." The wording troubled her. Not because of what it said, because of what it implied. Us. Plural. Lydia had not acted alone. Near the altar, Miss Marple paused suddenly. The stone floor appeared uneven. Inspector Graves noticed immediately. "What is it?" she pointed gently. One section of flooring showed fresher mortar than the surrounding stone. Recently repaired, perhaps. Or concealed. The inspector crouched immediately beside it. After several tense minutes, constables pried the stone upward carefully. A cold silence filled the chapel. Beneath the floor rested a narrow hidden compartment, and inside, human bones. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. "Poor Evelyn." Inspector Graves removed his hat slowly. The remains appeared old, very old. A faded coat button still clung to fragments of fabric beside them, and near the skull rested a silver bracelet engraved with delicate initials. EF. No one spoke for several moments. Outside, wind moved softly through the bare trees surrounding the chapel. At last Inspector Graves said quietly, "She never left Blackthorn Hollow at all." By evening the village stood frozen beneath shock. Evelyn Fenwick had not vanished. She had been murdered, and hidden beneath the chapel floor for 20 years. Miss Marple sat silently inside Ravenscroft House, while Inspector Graves paced heavily before the fireplace. "Richard Vale killed her," he muttered. "Almost certainly. Possibly." The inspector stopped abruptly. "Possibly." Miss Marple lifted her eyes calmly. "My dear Inspector, we must be careful not to mistake the obvious answer for the correct one." He stared at her. "Evelyn arranged a meeting with Lydia and Vale. Her body is hidden beneath the chapel. Vale blackmailed Lydia afterward." "Yes. And yet you still doubt it." Miss Marple looked toward the darkened windows thoughtfully. "One detail troubles me greatly." "What detail?" "Evelyn trusted Lydia enough to attend that meeting willingly." Miss Marple's voice remained quiet. "But if Lydia watched her sister murdered, why continue living beside the chapel all these years?" The inspector frowned deeply. "Guilt, perhaps." She folded her knitting carefully. "Or fear of someone else entirely." Before he could answer, hurried footsteps sounded in the hallway. Adrian Mercer entered pale and visibly shaken. "They found her," he whispered. Inspector Graves nodded once. "Yes." Mercer lowered himself heavily into a chair. For several moments he simply stared into the fire silently. Then softly, "She hated churches." Miss Marple looked toward him gently. "Why?" She said silence felt heavier inside them. Pain moved across his face visibly now. Real grief. Long-buried grief finally given shape. "I should have protected her," he murmured. Miss Marple watched him quietly. "You loved her very much." "Yes." The single word sounded exhausted beyond measure. Then suddenly, Mercer looked toward Inspector Graves sharply. "There's something you still don't understand." The room became still. "What?" asked the inspector. Mercer's expression darkened. Richard Vale wasn't the one Evelyn feared most at the end. Miss Marple became very still, interesting indeed. "Who did she fear?" she asked softly. Adrian Mercer hesitated, then quietly, "Lydia." Silence settled through Ravenscroft House like cold smoke. Inspector Graves stared at him in disbelief. "You think Lydia killed her own sister?" Mercer looked toward the fire again. "I think Lydia chose Richard Vale over Evelyn that night." His voice lowered further, and afterward she became trapped by what she'd done. Miss Marple felt another piece slide quietly into place. Not direct murder, perhaps, but betrayal powerful enough to lead to death. And suddenly she understood something chilling. Lydia Fenwick had spent 20 years not merely fearing exposure, but fearing someone who knew exactly how responsible she truly was. The one person nobody feared snow arrived during the night. By morning, Blackthorn Hollow lay beneath a thin white silence that softened rooftops, hedges, and church paths alike. Smoke drifted from cottage chimneys into pale winter skies, while villagers moved cautiously through the lanes, speaking in hushed, uneasy voices. The discovery of Evelyn Fenwick's body beneath St. Anne's Chapel had shaken the village profoundly. Old gossip had become murder, and now every familiar face seemed capable of hiding terrible things. Miss Marple sat beside the fire at Ravenscroft House, while Inspector Graves studied Lydia Fenwick's letters once more with growing frustration. "We know Lydia betrayed Evelyn," he said. "We know Richard Vale profited from wartime leaks. We know someone murdered Vale before he could speak publicly." He closed the file sharply. "Yet Lydia herself still doesn't fit properly." Miss Marple threaded another stitch calmly. "Because Lydia was frightened. She had reason to be frightened." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, "but not only of exposure." The inspector looked toward her immediately. "You've reached a conclusion." "Almost." Outside, snowflakes drifted quietly against the windows. Miss Marple's thoughts had settled slowly during the night, arranging scattered details into something deeply unpleasant. Not Richard Vale. Not Adrian Mercer. Someone else entirely had moved through the shadows of this case almost unnoticed. Which, she reflected sadly, was often the most dangerous position of all. That afternoon, Miss Marple requested a final gathering at Ravenscroft House. Inspector Graves appeared sceptical but agreed. By 6 o'clock, the principal figures connected to the case assembled uneasily inside Lydia Fenwick's study. Adrian Mercer stood near the fireplace looking exhausted. Thomas Whitmore arrived pale but recovering from his injuries. Dr. Matthew Colby sat silently beside the window. Mrs. Eliza Trent clasped nervous hands together near the bookshelf, and Reverend Lionel Pierce remained near the doorway with visible discomfort. Snow fell steadily outside while firelight flickered across the dark room. Inspector Graves closed the study door firmly. Miss Marple looked around the room quietly before speaking. "Human beings," she began softly, "often imagine murder begins with violence. In reality, it usually begins much earlier, with fear, jealousy, cowardice. Small acts of betrayal left to grow quietly over time. No one interrupted. 20 years ago, Evelyn Fenwick discovered wartime corruption connected to Richard Vale. She intended to expose it. Lydia Fenwick, frightened of scandal and emotionally entangled with Vale, betrayed her sister's trust. Adrian Mercer lowered his eyes painfully. Miss Marple continued gently. Evelyn agreed to meet Lydia and Richard Vale at St. Anne's Chapel, believing matters could still be resolved peacefully. Thomas Whitmore spoke hoarsely, but instead she died. Yes, silence settled heavily through the room. Inspector Graves folded his arms. "You believe Vale killed her?" Miss Marple shook her head slowly. "No." The room became very still. Adrian Mercer looked up sharply. "If not Vale, then who?" Miss Marple's gaze moved quietly across the faces before resting finally upon one person. Dr. Matthew Colby. The village physician went completely motionless. Inspector Graves frowned instantly. "Colby?" Miss Marple's voice remained calm. "My dear doctor, you have hidden yourself inside this tragedy remarkably well." Dr. Colby gave a faint, strained laugh. "This is absurd." "Is it?" The fire crackled sharply between them. Miss Marple folded her hands neatly in her lap. "You treated Lydia Fenwick for years. You knew her fears intimately. You understood the blackmail payments. And most importantly," she paused gently, "you were connected to Evelyn Fenwick long before anyone realized." Dr. Colby's expression tightened slightly. Inspector Graves stared at him. "What connection?" Miss Marple looked toward the doctor quietly. "You loved Evelyn too." Silence crashed through the room. Mrs. Trent covered her mouth softly. Thomas Whitmore looked stunned. Dr. Colby remained very still for several moments. Then finally he said quietly, "She deserved better than all of you." The room chilled instantly. Inspector Graves stepped forward. "You were there at the chapel." The doctor's face hardened slowly. "Yes." No one moved. Snow whispered softly against the windows beyond Ravenscroft House. Miss Marple's eyes rested sadly upon him. "Evelyn trusted you." A shadow crossed his face. "She trusted everyone." Bitterness entered his voice now openly. "That was her weakness. What happened that night?" Inspector Graves demanded. Dr. Colby looked toward the fire. Richard Vale panicked after Evelyn threatened exposure. Lydia begged her to remain silent. They argued. His jaw tightened visibly. Then Evelyn said she would go directly to military authorities in London. "And you killed her," Graves said coldly. The doctor closed his eyes briefly. I only meant to stop her leaving. Silence followed. Miss Marple felt no surprise now, only sadness. How? She asked softly. She tried running, his voice lowered. I grabbed her. She fell against the stone steps. The chapel, the hidden grave. A frightened young woman dying because everyone around her chose self-preservation over truth. Dr. Colby stared downward. When I realized she was dead, Vale wanted the body moved immediately. Lydia became hysterical. A hollow laugh escaped him. None of us intended murder when we arrived there that night. But afterward, said Miss Marple quietly, you all became murderers together. No one spoke. The doctor looked suddenly older than before. 20 years older, perhaps. Inspector Graves's expression darkened. You hid her beneath the chapel floor. Yes. And Richard Vale blackmailed Lydia afterward. Dr. Colby nodded once. Vale understood Lydia would pay endlessly to avoid scandal. Miss Marple watched him carefully, and eventually Lydia feared Adrian Mercer's return would expose everything. The doctor's face shifted slightly. There were documents, which you searched for after her death. Another silence. Inspector Graves spoke sharply now. You killed Lydia too. Dr. Colby's eyes lifted slowly. No. Miss Marple believed him instantly. Interesting. Very interesting indeed. You frightened her, she said softly. The doctor looked exhausted suddenly. I confronted her after Mercer arrived. She panicked. Her heart. He stopped speaking. She died naturally, Inspector Graves muttered bitterly. Not naturally, Miss Marple corrected quietly. But not intentionally either. Dr. Colby stared into the fire. I spent 20 years listening to Lydia's guilt. His voice trembled faintly now. Every week, every month, watching fear destroy her piece by piece. And Richard Vale? Asked Inspector Graves sharply. The doctor looked toward him calmly at last. That was me. Silence filled Ravenscroft House completely. Adrian Mercer rose abruptly. You murdered him. Yes. Why? For the first time, genuine emotion broke openly across Dr. Colby's face. Because Evelyn never stopped dying while he lived comfortably. The room remained utterly still. There it was at last. Not greed. Not ambition. Love poisoned by guilt and time. Miss Marple looked towards the snowed darkness beyond the windows. 20 years earlier, one frightened decision had destroyed every life connected to it, and now at the very end, death had finally returned for all of them quietly through the storm. When the storm finally passed, 3 days after Dr. Matthew Colby's confession, the snow began to melt across Blackthorn Hollow. Water dripped steadily from cottage roofs while grey winter sunlight spread weakly over the village lanes. The sharp silence that had settled after Evelyn Fenwick's body was discovered slowly gave way to ordinary sounds again. Cartwheels along the bridge road, distant barking dogs, church bells ringing softly through the cold air. Life, Miss Marple reflected, resumed itself even after terrible truths. It always did. Yet Blackthorn Hollow had changed, not visibly perhaps. The cottages still stood beneath drifting smoke. The hedges still curled beside the narrow roads. Ravenscroft House still watched the village from beyond the hill like a dark memory refusing to disappear. But the illusion of respectability had cracked, and once cracked, such things never repaired completely. Miss Marple sat beside the drawing-room window at Harrow Cottage, watching villagers pass carefully through melting snow. Mrs. Briggs folded laundry nearby with unusual quietness. I still can't believe it was Dr. Colby, she murmured at last. People rarely suspect those who spend years appearing useful. The older woman shook her head slowly. He delivered half the village children. And buried half the village dead, Miss Marple replied softly. Silence settled briefly between them. Then Mrs. Briggs asked quietly, Do you think he ever meant to kill Evelyn? Miss Marple looked toward the pale winter sky beyond the window. I think frightened people often convince themselves they're preventing disaster while creating one instead. Inspector Graves visited later that afternoon before returning permanently to London. He looked exhausted, though calmer now. that the case had finally ended. "Colby signed a full statement this morning," he said while warming his hands near the fire. "Everything matches the evidence." Miss Marple nodded gently. "And Lydia?" The inspector exhaled slowly. "Legally, she cannot answer for her part anymore." He looked toward the flames thoughtfully. "But morally?" "Yes," said Miss Marple quietly. "Morally, she answered every day for 20 years. Outside, melting snow slid softly from the cottage roof. Inspector Graves removed a folded paper from his coat pocket. "Adrian Mercer asked me to give you this." Miss Marple unfolded the paper carefully. Inside rested an old photograph of Evelyn Fenwick, standing beside the river near Blackthorn Bridge. She was laughing at something outside the frame, her face bright with life, and completely untouched by fear. On the back, Adrian Mercer had written only one sentence. She deserved a longer life than secrets allowed her. Miss Marple closed the photograph gently. "How is Mr. Mercer?" she asked. "He's leaving England." The inspector hesitated briefly. "I think staying here became unbearable, understandable. Some griefs finally grew too heavy for familiar places." Inspector Graves stood after a moment. "You solved it long before I did. My dear Inspector, villages repeat themselves endlessly. Only names and fashions change." A faint smile crossed his face. "You make human nature sound hopeless." Miss Marple resumed her knitting calmly. "Not hopeless, merely consistent." Ravenscroft House stood empty by the beginning of January. Lawyers arrived from London to settle Lydia Fenwick's estate, while villagers passed the property with visible unease. Curtains had been removed from the windows, leaving the house exposed and strangely vulnerable beneath the pale winter skies. Miss Marple visited once more before departing Blackthorn Hollow. The rooms echoed quietly now without Lydia's presence. No tension remained, only absence. She wandered slowly through the study where Lydia Fenwick died. The fireplace stood cold, the desk drawers empty, yet Miss Marple could almost feel the years of fear that had once lived there. The hidden letters, the blackmail payments, the endless dread of truth returning one day through the door, and eventually it had. Not dramatically, not violently at first, simply with a knock during a storm. Human lives, she thought sadly, often unravelled through the smallest moments. A single betrayal, a frightened lie, one cowardly decision made too late at night. Then years passed while consequences waited patiently in silence. Thomas Whitmore left flowers at St. Anne's Chapel every Sunday afterward. Simple white roses usually. Nobody disturbed them. The villagers spoke to him, more gently now than they had in years, though guilt lingered quietly throughout Blackthorn Hollow. Too many people remembered how easily they once believed terrible accusations about Evelyn Fenwick. Too few had defended her. Miss Marple understood that villagers preferred collective innocence after tragedy. It comforted them. But comfort rarely changed truth. On her final evening in Blackthorn Hollow, Miss Marple walked alone toward the old bridge where Adrian Mercer's motorcar had first been discovered. The river moved quietly beneath fading winter light, while distant smoke drifted above the village rooftops. Cold air carried the faint sound of church bells across the hills. She paused beside the stone railing thoughtfully. The mystery was solved, the guilty uncovered. Yet the ending felt sorrowful rather than triumphant, because Evelyn Fenwick had not died merely from violence. She had died because too many people valued reputation above courage. Lydia feared scandal. Richard Vale feared exposure. Dr. Colby feared losing the woman he loved. And an entire village feared uncertainty enough to condemn an innocent girl without proof. Fear, Miss Marple reflected, was among the most dangerous forces in human nature. Far more dangerous than hatred sometimes. A carriage rolled slowly across the distant lane behind her, life continuing again. Always continuing. Miss Marple adjusted her gloves against the cold and turned back toward the village lights. Then quietly, almost to herself, she said, "Storms pass eventually, but the things people do during them." She paused gently. "Those remain." The wind moved softly through the bare winter trees, and somewhere beyond the hills, Night settled peacefully at last, over Blackthorn Hollow, the village where a stranger once knocked during the storm, and the past finally answered the door.